Welcome to Truth Behind Travel Podcast, a platform for tourism, travel, and hospitality professionals and enthusiasts to share, learn, and unlearn what we need to create better tourism, protect the environment, and become better humans. I'm your host, Dolores Semeraro, and every week I bring on the podcast the voices of those out there making a difference to learn the hard truth behind the world of travel and tourism, what works and what we can collectively do better. Welcome to Season 4, a series of conversations fully dedicated to women in travel, the trailblazers, the visionaries who have been and continue to be the force for good we need to hear more from. Joining us on the show, I am thrilled to welcome Truth Behind Travel podcast sponsor, Women Travel Leaders. Women Travel Leaders is a community that supports high-performing, purpose-driven travel business leaders to grow their business in less time by fostering a community of heart-led leaders who prioritize authenticity and impact above all else. Are you ready to start thriving in your travel business and your life through connecting with a powerful community that truly has your back? Well, head over to the show notes and on the link, mention Dolores in the referrer name to first access when applications open and receive 25% off your first year of membership. On this episode, I am thrilled to sit down with an iconic voice in tourism, a woman that has seen firsthand some of the most radical events across the tourism industry over the years and was able to so passionately and graciously take all those lucky enough to work with her on a journey of resilience, curiosity, and innovation. She sees herself as a sense maker, a communicator, a catalyst, happy to delve beneath the surface details in order to discern and describe the shape and power of underlying forces in the tourism industry. She is driven by curiosity in finding patterns and asking the most important questions. She is an acclaimed keynote speaker, co-founded and co-developed the UK's first internet-based digital destination management system, and founded Conscious Travel to help others make sense of an increasingly bewildering world and feel confident to take action. The conversation we had on this episode is dense of sense-making, philanthropic logic and truth, ranging from how working in silos damages us instead of working as a network. We also looked into how we have internalized the stereotypes of society and how we've moved from being explorers to consumers. Let's welcome the incredible Anna Pollock. Welcome back to the show, Season 4 of Truth Behind Travel. Today, I have a guest on the podcast that needs no introduction. Anna, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Dolores, for having me today.
Travel is something that really has accompanied you throughout your life. And before we go into a range of questions that I can't wait to ask you, I would love for you to just give us an overview of the journey. You could share with us what really made you, what brought you to where you are today?
Well, I guess I've always loved travel because I've always been interested in what's on the other side of a hill. My background actually is I grew up in a beautiful county called Sussex in southern England. And at a time when it was possible for young people to be able to walk about and travel and experience nature, for example, by themselves. So at a very young age, I was off on my bike, going on the country lanes. No one worried about that. So I think developed my curiosity for places and my love of geography. And I went on to study geography. And my geography studies took me then to New Zealand for a scholarship. And I realized then that I love learning. I didn't feel I was suited to the academic environment. So I decided to set off, and I'd met a Canadian while I was there, and I followed him off to Canada. On the way there, I just happened to get a job with the English Tourist Board, a brief job for the research department, but it put tourism on my resume at a time when Western Canada was just beginning to think about, do you think we could do something with tourism? Believe it or not, that was in the 70s. I was really heavily involved in technology and tourism. We introduced the internet to tourism, and changes in my life. My marriage broke up amicably, but I decided to come back to the UK with my daughter, who is 11, and I got very heavily involved in introducing the internet and technology to tourism destinations. The key thing about that was it really introduced me to the idea of networks, and we'll talk about that later, but realized that tourism, in fact, is a network. It's not an industry, actually. It doesn't work as an industry. And, just brought me into all kinds of areas of discovery outside tourism. And I guess what I've been doing is trying to apply it, say, what's the relevance of all this to the tourism sector? That led me to consulting here and writing and so on and so on. So a long story, but then I am getting older now, so there's a lot to say.
Well, you certainly are not slowing down, and we see you in many forums and as an international speaker and writer. I've been following the work and the content that you've been sharing, and one of the things that really comes through is the clarity of message and how something, especially on the subject of tourism and most recently on regenerative tourism, and how the complexity of what is needed to really embrace tourism in this way. It's often leaves rooms for misunderstanding, and a lot of organizations around the world are doing their best. Some are doing nothing. Some could be doing more. So there's a lot of disparity, and I see the tourism industry nowadays. It's a land of contrast. You cannot do tourism and do only good. There will always going to be an element of, I wouldn't say an element of darkness, but an element that doesn't necessarily bring 100% of goodness. And I've met professionals from really different regions of the world: Asia, Indian Ocean, Africa, Europe. Some are doing a lot, some are doing nothing. And we can't really say that nowadays the conversation around tourism in the international ecosystem, it's a conversation that nobody knows about it. Nobody's a novice anymore when it comes to sustainability, conscious travel. Yet there's a failure. There are organizations, there are tourism entrepreneurs, there are operators that are still failing. Why is that?
So why? Well, first of all, I mean, that is the really big question, because we're talking about a phenomenally big industry. Now, I will say it isn't actually an industry. It's a network of billions of customers served by hundreds of millions of suppliers. So they're all acting semi-autonomously, semi-independently of one another. And other industries where the income and wealth are more concentrated, decisions can be made. I often argued when I was in Canada that you could get the decision makers in the forest industry, which was very important, in one room and decide to go in a certain direction. You would need the entire sort of big stadium that we had of 60,000 seats to get the same coverage in tourism. So we have to accept that it's a loose network. It's very difficult to lead it because of that. The second thing, I think, my experience of tourism is that people don't often live within these various silos. We have conversations within our networks in tourism as if we were somehow independent. Tourism doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a much larger society economy, and it's that where the change is actually happening. So tourism is being affected by that, but it's also going to affect it. And if you want to get really sort of conceptual, it's an economic phenomenon, if you like, that's embedded in and affected by a particular way of seeing, being, and doing that underpins how we operate our economies, how we operate society today. And the reason for this sort of, huge contrast in terms of, people really moving ahead quickly and other people not, is that way of seeing, being, and doing, which we call a paradigm, that's the assumptions that we have individually and collectively about how the world works, how we should behave, how we define success, how we relate to each other and other living things on the planet. That set of assumptions is going through a dramatic change. And not many people even are aware of that, okay? But it affects how we think and how we make sense of our world. But those assumptions have, been formed several hundred years ago and been developing more or less since the beginning of science, okay? And the Industrial Revolution. So we've internalized those assumptions, things like, I'm separate from you and you, this country is separate from that. This notion of separation is fundamental to our way of seeing things. We have internalized all the things that our parents told us, to get ahead, you've got to look after yourself, and it's a harsh world out there, and if you don't do it, somebody else will. Those kind of assumptions, they've become internalized. We're not often aware that we have them. And you can't change something if you don't know you've got something within you that needs to change. Now, that paradigm, that way of looking at the world has actually, been very helpful. I mean, since the birth of science and the Industrial Revolution, human species has just gone from strength to strength. The population has exploded, and we're now the most powerful animal on the planet. We have completely, in the process of completely changing ecosystems around the world. And we are now in a point of being able to decide whether life as we know it on this planet continues. I think life always will continue, but it may not be in a form that makes it possible for us to continue. The reason I'm mentioning all this is that the root cause of the sort of volatility and the confusion that's existing at the moment is that paradigm, those set of assumptions aren't working for us anymore. A lot of writers are using terms like we're in the great unraveling period. And they'll start to say, it's not just one crisis, it's many. We've got biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, wealth inequality, the impact of artificial intelligence, political polarization. All of these things are happening, and they're now being called one big polycrisis. So, the point is the rubber's hitting the road right now. We're going to have to really look at how we think. And we cannot continue to look at all of those subjects separately. And that's the other, for example, we've had COP about climate, and there's a COP now about biodiversity, and those two have been kept separate for well over 10 years. And that's crazy, because you cannot separate the climate from nature. And so only now are we beginning to see that the actions we take over here affect us over there, and we need to look at these deeper than that, to the root cause. And the root cause is the way we think. And that's why we're living in a period of what's called VUCA period. It's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And so therefore, is it really a surprise that some of us get it, some don't, and there's a lot of confusion?
The effect of today's volatile environment, what is the effect that you recognize on tourism?
Tourism has been happening for hundreds of years. We called it hospitality. It was a natural thing. In fact, I prefer to use the word hospitality more often than tourism, because that's the core activity. It is the act of a host welcoming a stranger and looking after them, all right? And it involves travel, because sometimes these two meet accidentally, as it were. That's the core of our business. And when I started out in Canada, for example, that had been going on, but it wasn't recognized as an economic phenomenon. And frankly, globally, tourism has not been recognized as a specific economic phenomenon with its own set of accounts, for example, which is what mattered in this economic world, until relatively recently. It's grown and grown and grown to the point where it couldn't be ignored, but it still didn't seem to have that economic legitimacy until the last 20 years or so. And during that period, my experience was everyone in tourism felt they weren't being taken seriously. They weren't getting the recognition they deserved. And so what they did was they began to, well, how do we do that? Well, we have to use the same kind of language. Instead of experiences, we started then talking about products. And the economist said, you're not productive. So we started thinking about productivity and efficiency and scale. We started to talk about, oh, well, maybe we can show them that we are a legitimate industry because we sell to consumers, obviously, but we have agents. We have the retailers, we have wholesalers, tour operators became wholesalers. We started to use that economic language in order to get that sense of legitimacy, actually. And as time went by, the emphasis was more and more on productivity, on volume, on selling. And we became an extractive, quote, industry. This was one of the reasons there's a lot of confusion because, it's not so much confusion, but it has in fact done some damage because we've taken out the human element of hospitality and turned it into a big business. And in those when you apply those economic rules of productivity, etc., scale is absolutely everything. More is more important than anything else. So everyone felt if we had to grow tourism to show that we were an effective economic driver, because that gave us legitimacy. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why, because tourism had this enormous dynamic, the minute you started mass transportation, followed by this internet, the internet has had a phenomenal impact in connecting people, making people want to go to places they wouldn't have considered before. All of these things, that and just rising prosperity in many countries, has caused this phenomenal growth. And then the politicians woke up. Oh, right, we're making tax revenue from this. And therefore, more tax revenue is better than next year. And that's what's led to virtually every destination setting growth in volume as their primary target. And that's why we now have all of the negative aspects of over-tourism, the pollution from emissions and contrails, etc., plastics, chemicals, water shortages in some places, plus many of the other impacts that we're in other industries that we're now suffering from, including, the industrial agriculture, industrial pollution, etc. So they're all interlinked. But I think it was that drive to get legitimate that turned us into an economic engine or a cog in an economic engine.
We shifted from considering people, explorer, into considering them consumers.
Yeah.
How sad is that?
Well, it's sad, but frankly, that is what's been driving this economic growth since the war. Everything became based on volume. I mean, for example, after the war, a huge amount of productive capability was developed to win that war, the last war, every war. They're expensive, so you have to do an awful lot of work after a war to make up for it. There's a lot of rebuilding that takes place. But I mean, things, for example, we look at the proliferation of chemical fertilizers and pesticides in agriculture. That started after the war, when they had all of this chemical production capability that was used for basically for bombs and other nasty things. And then they applied that to the agricultural sector. So because they had this enormous productive capacity at the time. But it just was something that we can't blame anyone about. It was you could argue it was a natural progression, but the reality is it just has gone too far. And in tourism, yes, I think we have this idea of a visitor, a guest being a consumer. You have a completely different mindset when you see it that way. And then the consumer starts to think, well, they have a completely different mindset because they have the right to go anywhere. And then the investors feel they have the right to go and say, well, there's somebody's written a beautiful article about this or a movie about this fantastic beach in Thailand. I better go and buy land there because people are going to want to come. And the next thing you know, it looks like the Costa del Sol. That's a natural process of the nature of this economic engine. So yes, it's hard to say how do you turn that back. We can talk a bit more about that later. But what I think is happening is that human beings are waking up to the fact that this is not producing the happy end result we wanted. And how do we now remake and rethink all of our activities on the planet?
At the time of heavy and fast and furious development of tourism that has happened over the last 30, 35, 40 years, the voices that were heard in the industry were the voices of the business owners, the ones developing the businesses. And what we hear now instead is a huge and growing range of voices of the people that are there to welcome the visitors, the local communities, right? And if the visitors per se are already coming into a destination holding a narrative of consumerism, how can we ever expect them to travel embracing more sustainable practices? I mean, what do we need to change there? What needs to change there?
Well, I'm very glad you asked that question, Dolores, because I think right now the assumption is that it is the visitor who has to change. And frankly, I don't think that's right at all. I think we have created a visitor that expects to consume, considers it a right. They've got the wealth. You've been told that once you're wealthy, you can go travel anywhere. We've built that market up as well, and those expectations and those attitudes in many cases. And so at the moment, what I see is some suggestion that, we've got to change the visitor's behavior, or we've got to have the right visitor and that kind of thing. And that, again, is deflecting from where the responsibility sits. The responsibility sits, in my opinion, with the businesses, okay? And as you quite rightly point out, in many cases, we brought that extractive mentality that economics is about taking a resource, making something of it, adding, if you like, value, but making something of it that we can then sell, that someone can buy, and then it can be consumed and thrown away. That is the fundamental economic model that we have, and we've incorporated that a little bit into tourism, and so the assumption that a place was a resource. Now, a place actually is what they call in economics a common good. It's the place where those people live. It's their home. And for a long time there, we just completely ignored that. And we allowed people to come in who had more money than the people in that home, in that destination, to either buy up land. Yes, it was creating jobs. These are still the big excuses. We'll have hotels, they'll employ people that wouldn't otherwise be employed, and so on and so on. And so we then get this chain of economic productivity and seemingly greater growth. But again, at no point until very recently were any of those investors and developers and business owners asked to pay all of the costs associated with that. So you take things like water, that's a common good. And yet the tourists, we know, a hotel is built, the tourist expects a certain standard, and their consumption of that common good is so disproportionate to the consumption by the people who actually live there that things get very much out of balance. So it's I don't like pointing the finger because there's no one culprit. I mean, all of us are utterly involved in this. I travel, you travel. We're all contributors, but I do think personally that it's time now for the travel industry to be more honest about what it has done in the past and how that needs to change. If I can give you one example, I mean that the economists and the politicians love to point to the growth in spending, to the income that's coming in. These are things they can count, and that's a reflection of an old paradigm. If you can't count it, it's not worth doing, you know. But what are they counting? They're counting what is known as the sort of gross impact, where how much money is coming in. What they're not counting is how much money is going out. So if most of the investment was, let's say, foreign investment, because that's where the capital was coming from, an awful lot of that income actually does go out of the country as well. That's called leakage. And if there's one statistic that we could be counting, that we're systematically trying to avoid counting, is simply that. So, you take a Pacific country, I won't name any names, but, 82% of the income often that's going into that country is actually disappearing because it's going back to the investors who are foreign. That's not healthy. And that's the kind of honesty that we need to have now. How can we change that so that there are opportunities now for the people in these countries for whom it's home to say just how much visitation can we cope with? What of ourselves do we wish to share? What aspects of our culture do we not wish to see, spoiled just to make it more convenient? Because a visitor wants to see the culture but doesn't want to sit through a ceremony that lasts 8 hours when we can compress it into 15 minutes, get back on the bus and do something else. I mean, I know some of these are old cliched examples, but they hold relevance still, I think.
It's a dialogue that needs to constantly be there between the tourism development vision of a destination and I call them the doers. Like I've been traveling across Greece for the last few months, and I see how pretty much 90% of the businesses and the doors are closed. When we talk about, using tourism as an opportunity for growth, for development of a place to bring more wealth generated by tourism into a destination, I've been wondering are we missing an opportunity here? For example, I'm taking Greece as an example as I'm here right now. And then I've been having these conversations with local hospitality managers. The answer was unanimous. They said, Dolores, the locals do want to have a break. You actually cannot impose a greater idea of a greater vision of traveling off season or extending seasonality or an all year round offerings. Because the locals do want to have their time off. They have other things to do. They're happy to close for a few months and come back next year. So my question is, before strategizing in today's tourism industry, are we actually asking to the local communities, to the locals, as we said, if that's what they want? And if they don't want it, then what can we do about it? And I feel that this conversation seems to be happening in many outlets around the tourism industry for the sake of happening. And here I am witnessing it firsthand that they do not want it.
Yeah,
So, where do we stand? Where is that fine line?
No, I think you've raised a really important point. I think finally, after many, many years, there is a growing recognition that the host community is the most important of all. If you want to see this working, I believe you look at indigenous communities. They are so closely connected with the land and the nature. They have a very fundamentally different paradigm than the one that we have in the West. And so now we're being asked to look at how systems work, and systems work together in harmony. And no one part of any system can just look after itself. All right. The most important rule in nature is that you contribute to the system of which you are a part, right? So now that kind of thinking is seeping into our consciousness. It's how it happens. And we're beginning to recognize, okay, we can't operate in isolation of what our community, the system we're living in or working in, actually wants. But we're just at the very beginning of that. I saw the change happening when people started saying, well, we have to survey, the destination marketing organization said, oh, yes, we better make sure that our residents are happy. So off they went with the clipboards, and you know how you can organize a survey to more or less get what you want. Oh, yes, they're really happy. We can carry on doing this for another 5-10 years. That was the first step, but it wasn't enough. What I'm seeing happening in some communities is there are either communities beginning to kind of wake up, if you like, and say, we must take care of ourselves. We must identify the place we wish to become or what we want for us. In other cases, that's being introduced. But they're now starting to get involved in that decision. And some places, the tourism industry is saying, and this to me is the biggest change, it's not what can you do for us? We're the tourism industry. We're going to bring you jobs and all the rest of it. What kind of tax incentives are you going to give, or planning permissions are you going to give so that we can do all this great economic thing? Now they're starting to say, how can we contribute to making this community a better place? But you can only do that with any degree of legitimacy when you become part of that community. And that's why I feel hospitality has got such a wonderful opportunity today, because it's the one part of this economic engine we call tourism that actually is embedded in a place. So hoteliers and restaurateurs have to be there all the time. So ideally, they are people from that place, but not always. There may be people who moved there to open a restaurant. That's fine. But once there, they can't move, because the one thing that differentiates tourism from other economic activities is we move the customer to the point of, quote, consumption. In other industries, we sell it out. So these are the aspects of our sector that are rooted. And again, that's important because that's very much how natural systems work. The plants are rooted. The trees are rooted. They don't just pick up and walk like in some Disney movie. They are there, and therefore they're responding always to the unique conditions of that ecosystem, that ecology of which they're a part. So I think the restaurateurs and the hoteliers could play a major role in helping to bring a community together around what they want for the future and what issues they feel need to be attended to. That's the shift I see, and it's a beautiful thing to watch, but it's very slow at the moment.
One of the aspects that I've always observed in community empowerment is how the sense of being proud, the pride of belonging, that sense of belonging would be encouraged, would be nurtured and fostered across the communities. Because if locals are not proud of the heritage, of the cultural background that they carry forward, how can they authentically and genuinely showcase it to visitors, right? So nurturing that sense of belonging and nurturing that sense of pride really ultimately sits into honoring their roots. And so this rooting, this really grounding mechanism, it's something that should be embedded into a destination development strategy as such. My question is, do you see that as a process of of really guaranteeing and creating true empowerment for local communities?
Yes, you've expressed that extremely well. I think exactly that. This sense of pride of who are we, basically. If you think about it, this industrial economic engine that we've had over the last basically 50 years or more has actually tried to take that away from places and people. To me, it's a form of modern day colonialism when we go this Western world, the northern hemisphere, they call the global north, if you like, has been going out and telling an awful lot of beautiful people and places that somehow they're inferior. They need to be living the way we live. And so, when I saw the first Starbucks in Bali, for example, I cried. I cried because it had exactly the same furniture in it as the Starbucks that I'd been to in Seattle just a few weeks before. And that led to all these chains. Again, just think of the language, the chains or the brands, popping up in all kinds of places and making out that their way of serving coffee was somehow superior to the way that the Balinese had been doing it for some time before. I've just recently been privileged to spend a fair amount of time in the Pacific, and working in a particular beautiful country called Vanuatu. Vanuatu happens to be one of the classified as one of the poorest countries in the world, but it also has been clearly, and survey after survey after survey, it's number one or number two, the happiest place in the world. But again, their sense of confidence and pride in their culture has been knocked back because they weren't serving Western food, they weren't behaving, and they weren't dressed up in suits and all the rest of it. Totally inappropriate in that climate, by the way. But the point is, there was a sense of we have to behave differently if we're going to get acknowledged as participants in this global society. But then COVID came. So they had been told to have all these hotels and to cater to the visitors because they needed the foreign exchange. And so foreign investors came in, bought the hotels, opened the hotels. The young people went to work in the hotels. They began to dislike their own food because the Western food seemed more exotic. That was more important to have, rice and ketchup if you can get it, and hamburgers. And then COVID came. And those investors just closed everything down, just left them high and dry. And those people, fortunately, their traditional cultures were still alive. The elders said, okay, they didn't have plan B. We have. Come home. Come home into your village. Learn how we grow taro. That's what we have lived on for all these years. Learn how to fish. Learn how to understand nature. Learn how to construct when things get destroyed by a hurricane. Learn your own language, your culture, your songs, your rituals. And that's exactly what they've done. And that has re-established their sense of identity. Fortunately, post-COVID, the kind of visitor that's coming to those islands now is different. They don't want to sit by a pool and drink martinis or whatever, as they would have done in the 50s and 60s. They now want to go out and experience village life. And these beautiful people are shaping those experiences from within their own culture, and seeing the visitors' excitement is reinforcing that pride. But in that case, they had never really lost it, but they needed that sort of jolt, particularly to in a sense, help the young people rediscover who they are. So it's a beautiful story because I'm just seeing so many examples of entrepreneurial initiative by creating new experiences, new products, new things, but it's coming entirely from within, and as you say, from a state of pride.
And it's the ability of being able to get to know these stories and the ability to be able to be so connected all the time, everywhere, with everything, to have informations at our fingertips at any moment. And earlier on our conversation, you touched on, as a pioneer of showcasing what the internet can do for the tourism industry. I want to go back to that for a moment because, especially as we live now, we're probably living through the era of the artificial intelligence adoptions and all kinds of technology that is portrayed as the ultimate way of doing tourism or the ultimate way of managing tourism destination, creating smart tourism processes. So lots of technology, left, right, and center, and seeing a lot of confusion these days happening in the industry. How do we, as for yourself, as a pioneer of that technology for the tourism industry, how do you see what is happening today? Where can we find the silver linings in this unmonitored adoption of technology across the industry?
Yeah, I think I'm probably going to show my age now because, yes, I was an early proponent and adopter of internet technology back in the 70s. I mean, no, that's too early. Probably, I did the first travel and technology conference in Vancouver in 1993, and I was introduced to the internet then by some students. And at the first, I said, "Well, this reminds me of early cars. You know, when you had to have a horse in front of you." Because it was so wretchedly slow. I mean, you press a button to a hyperlink and go and have coffee. But we began to see the potential, and I felt that this was a technology that the destination, the place could make best use of, because they were closest to the source of supply. And I spent actually 10 years trying to persuade destinations that this was the way to go, and we built one of the first destination management systems. But unfortunately, the private sector saw it long before destinations did. And then you got the OTAs. And once you got the OTAs, then again, responsibility for the control, the accuracy, the authenticity of the information was the opportunity to have that. I wouldn't say power, but that role and responsibility was lost. And so that reinforced the commoditization of it, the whole industry. It was another force for taking us down that direction. And now, of course, it's AI. And again, I mean, AI is incredibly expensive. It's making huge amounts of money for a relatively small number of people. And it's another complex level of complexity that is going to have the potential to separate us again from some reality. And when we're talking about, I haven't really thought this one through, because when it got to AI, I began to say, you know, I'm tired of this. What I would hate to see right now is attention being placed too much on technology as an intermediary of any description. It has served us well. It has enabled us to connect. I would prefer that we're using using technology as such for educational purposes, for sharing of knowledge, rather than distracting us into some kind of artificial way of being, as opposed to what is really mattering here. And to me, it's the human connection, and it's the connection is helping people really become aware of who we are as human beings, as being part of nature. And so technology gets in the way of that, actually, because the real technology is the inner technology that we have. We're born with it. We're born with a sensitivity. It's just that has been crowded out or drowned out or minimized by a need to rely on some kind of material machine to do something that we do naturally. I feel that the direction that we need to go is away from quantity and growth, which, by the way, is a subject that nobody wants to talk about. They want to talk about everything else, but not about the fact that we cannot continue to grow infinitely on a finite planet. It's just that is such a fundamental rule. There's not a single living being on this planet that can grow forever. That is a law of nature. You have a beginning, a middle, and end, and then a recycling, a composting, if you like. And yet tourism seems to think that despite COVID, maybe the lessons that could have been there during COVID, no, we can just keep on growing. And the percentages that they're talking about are incredible, because, and again, no one knows what a 5% per annum increase means. What does that look like? It sounds great, but it means that in 12 years you doubled in size. Can you imagine us doubling in size again? And what that would look like? Where the whole earth is beginning to be covered by hotels and shopping malls and parking lots, if you're not careful. And we now know that that is utterly unsustainable. So how do we redefine success? How do we redefine growth and talk about it in terms of increasing the value in not just in material terms? That's the other big shift, I think, is a shift away from from just measuring. Once you say if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and therefore it's not worth doing, you throw out the window all of those important things that cannot be measured. How do you measure the quality of this conversation that we're having? I'm enjoying it. You're enjoying it. I hope your listeners will enjoy it. But is there a measurement for that? It's a personal thing. Each of us is going to enjoy it in a different way. Similarly, when I go to a destination, what I will enjoy in Vanuatu will be different from someone coming from a different part of the world, in a different economy, a different society, etc. All I'm trying to get at is, why can't we start thinking about how we can build a good business and a good economy based on the quality of the experience, and how much of our being there in that place is helping that place develop itself in the way that works for it. So I think it's an unwillingness to face that fundamental truth and get that truth across to our politicians, that in the long run it will be far better for their communities and their voters if they're starting to see a qualitative improvement to their way of being, our way of living there, and a sense that there is something in that for their future generations.
If you were to map a mindset for a tourism professional, it's someone that is in hospitality, someone that runs a travel business, a person that would live and breathe that sustainability definition and work towards that goal, what would that mindset need to contain? I don't know what's the right word. Like, how would that mindset look like?
To me, it's a question of seeing the way life is, and learning how life works. So the mindset I would ask is or the message I would give would be the same as a famous ecologist called Gregory Bateson said. The problem is humans haven't yet learned to think the way that nature thinks. So step number one, recognize you are part of an infinite set of systems or wholes, and you contribute to the shape and nature of those wholes. So the mindset is one of I'm part of this system, I can contribute to this system. And so from a destination development point of view, it's really about how can we come together as a community and say, we are unique because we're in this particular piece of geography, if you like. I mean, every place is unique. What made us become who we are? So what's beautiful about nature is that it takes, there are some fundamental rules, if you like, or principles, and I'm not even going to try and talk about those today, that we can learn and that we can work with to live in harmony. So the mindset right now, I would ask people to consider is, first of all, it's a mindset of curiosity. How does life really work? And we can learn this now. I mean, it's some of the real leaders in this so-called regenerative living systems movement have saying the first thing we need to do is develop some ecological literacy. All right, and that's the beautiful thing about the internet. You can learn anything on the internet now. The second thing is an intrinsic part of this is that we're not just it's not just about what we do, it's about how we are inside. So it's developing our own sense of self, our own sense of who we are, what we care about, our values, what is really important to us? What are we prepared to fight for now? Are we courageous enough to stand up and say, no, I don't buy that piece of, propaganda, if you like. That's not who I am. Or as a community, that's not who we want to be. We don't want to be used. We want to have a sense of control over our own destiny. All of this is about beginning to take that much more responsibility for the whole. than we've done in the past. I think our current culture, our dying culture, because I think it is dying, asked us to become bystanders, just watch. The important people will take care of it. They'll set the pattern, they'll set the fashion, they'll set the values. We can't allow that to happen anymore. It's a long and fumbling answer, perhaps, to
I love it. I think
found an important question.
Well, if I may summarize it, curiosity, sense of self, clarity of values, and connectivity with nature, knowing that, if anything, we can bring our heartbeat back into in synchron with Mother Nature.
First of all, I would say it's education. Learn how life works where you are. And secondly, take responsibility for educating your peers so that together you can let the politicians know that this has to change. I think more and more where I'm at is writing papers. I can write papers till I'm blue in the face, but I think now I see the role is educating people so that they can educate their political leadership. It's only going to change that way, actually, when it becomes apparent that that's what the people are going to vote on next election, that we'll get any movement in the right direction. Because in the meantime, the big businesses are taking what they can get. They know it's going to end. They're taking absolutely everything they can before it does.
And then hopefully the people that are being educated today are eventually going to become the politicians of tomorrow, so we can break that cycle and have people that really actually understand the dynamics of nature, the world, the society, and how to live in sync.
And when you begin to get into this and you understand, it's fun to learn, by the way, that the importance of educating our children. So parents supporting their children. In fact, actually, what's happening right now, the children are educating their parents in many cases.
Absolutely.
But they are the future leaders. But we actually, I think we do need to work with the ones we've got. The second thing that I think that looking into the future, the big RE word is not just regeneration, which is literally means creating the conditions conducive for life to thrive. If you bear that in mind, then it takes away all the complexity of definitions and so on. You just take that sentence. Regeneration creates the conditions for life to thrive. So therefore, are my actions being regenerative? Are they creating the conditions for life to thrive?
It's true. And I mean, I'm super conscious of the time. I think
yes,
we can just continue this conversation
I hope
forever.
I don't ramble
love
too
it.
much.
Absolutely loving it. And it's really hard for me to wrap it up now, but I've been taking plenty of notes from this conversation. We've covered we've talked about the real pillar of everything being curiosity. We've touched upon how working in silos towards and as opposed to working as a network and how to enhance that network. We've looked into how we have internalized stereotypes, so to speak, and how as a society we have been trying to validate the efficacy and the validity per se of the tourism industry, how we've moved from explorers to consumers, and what that came with the responsibility lying in the businesses of the tourism industry. And then we looked into the technology and how technology enhances and or alters the relationship between humans and nature and their progress in society as in relation to tourism, and what is the mindset of the tourism professionals that really should, what are the if we are to map a mindset, what are the points?
It's such a big topic, and I sometimes think I ramble too much, but hopefully I've been succinct. I think if I had a conclusion or
yes,
I think if there's one thing I think we need to focus on in the future is going back to the essence of travel. It was always about going from one place to another, and partly because of the novelty of going to another place. Every other place was different. it's getting back to that. And therefore, each place, people in a place, getting back to that sense of community, which is, we talk about communities. Again, it's just another word, but it means that we share an idea of who we are and who we want to become. So bringing people together in that community to express their story of their place, and then start to take responsibility for its health, because that's the big objective. No health, no life. All right. So how do we take responsibility for that? And in that process, how then can we offer now and in the future a way of experiencing who we are, us, this place, in a way that inspires and educates the visitor, but also maintains the vitality and thrivability of who we are. So there's a management aspect built into that. So it's a sharing of a place that has now become truly unique. That's not just an overused adjective. It is unique, and it's expressed because all the participants in that community are digging deep into what makes them who they are. That would, if we start doing that and we stop talking about these technical terms like destination management and blah, 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 it's about people coming together and saying who we are, who we wish to become, and what do we wish to share with others in a loving, caring way. That is about it, as far as I'm concerned, very simply put.
Brilliant. Thank you so much,
Okay.
and all the best.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you for being with me and Anna today on Truth Behind Travel podcast, Season 4, sponsored by Women Travel Leaders. Don't forget to check out the show notes to get in touch with Anna Pollock and to learn more about conscious travel and how you can work with Anna on your next destination project. Before you go, take a moment to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss the next episode, or connect with me on social media. You'll find the podcast social pages on Facebook and Instagram at Truth Behind Travel Podcast. And if you have enjoyed this episode, share it with your friends and your community, because together we can amplify the voices that you're hearing on the podcast and let them be heard by more people. Until next time, farewell, my friends.